Hello and welcome to Dave's Geek Stuff, and today I'm going to be building a wall in Cinema 4D and then knocking it down. So we're going to be using the cloner object to build a wall, and then we're going to be using some of the physics simulation stuff to knock that wall down, and then I'll be kind of lighting it a little bit and giving the bricks some textures, but that's not going to be the main focus of this video. Okay, well, to get started with building a wall, first we need some bricks. So I'm going to make one brick. That's what I'm going to start with. So I'm going to add a cube object up here. Before I start, I'm just going to save this. I've already named the project Wall Destroyed by Ball. It's always good to save your project before you actually start it, because if you import any textures, then that makes sure that any files are put in the right place and you don't get file link problems later on. So always name your project, save it somewhere, and keep all your files together. So yeah, I'm going to click on the cube object, and I'm going to make this 40 centimeters by 20 by 20. Of course, you could use different dimensions if you wanted to, but I'm happy with that. And then I'm going to make a duplicate of that. There's two ways of making a duplicate. I can either, well, more than two ways. I could copy and paste, Control C, Control V. I could hold down Control and click on it and drag to underneath and create one. And my preferred method is to hold down Shift, start to move it, and you can see that locks it into increments of 10 centimeters, and then press Control while I'm doing it, which then duplicates the object, as you can see. And then I'm going to move it again by holding down Shift. Not first, start to move it, then hold down Shift, and then it will move in increments of 10 centimeters. That's the default. So I've got two bricks that are offset from each other. The top one is 20 centimeters over, so it's halfway down, and then we've got this shape here that I then want to group together. So I right click, I select both of those, right click and go group objects. I'm going to call that 2 bricks. And then I'm going to go up to MoGraph and go to Cloner. I'm going to put those 2 bricks inside a cloner, and as you'll see, we get copies of those bricks. Now I don't want them copied upwards like that, so if I click on the cloner I can say what mode it is. So I'm going to go for grid array. And as you can see, now we've got a 3-dimensional grid of these 2 bricks. I'm going to change that. I don't want it to repeat backwards, so I'm going to take this down to 1. I only want one copy of that. And I'm going to make the overall size, because it was 20 by 40, I'm going to do multiples of that. So I'm going to make it 800 by 400, because obviously 40 goes into 800 and 20 goes into 400. It's a nice amount. And then if I up the count on these, I believe this one will be 21 inside that, and this one here will be 11, and that will give us our wall. Now if I render that quickly, you'll see it's just plain. You don't see any of the outline, and that's because all the bricks are completely flat, so they just match up to each other and it makes a very solid surface. So I'm going to go back to the bricks here, select both the cubes and go down here to fillet, and you can see then it puts a little rounded edge on each one. I don't want that much of a rounded edge, so I'm going to bring it down to say 2, and then that there will look a little bit more like a wall. For now, that's all I'm going to do to the wall to make it look like a wall. Obviously I can make it look a lot more realistic, and I'm going to do a little bit of that later on. But the first thing I want to do after we've made the wall is to put in a floor object and then move up this wall so it's not under the floor at all. The tools up here do move and rotate and scale. I'm pretty much have it on move when I'm just doing things like this, and then I'll select rotate or scale if I need them, but by default I just keep stuff on move. Okay, so now we've got our wall built and it's on a floor. The next thing I want to do is knock it down. So to do that, I'm going to create a ball, just a random sphere. Again, holding down shift as I'm moving it will keep it locked to 10 centimeter increments. I only want the radius to be 50, and I'm going to move it up by 50 so that it's nicely sitting on the floor. And so that's our scene all ready to set up to use the ball to knock down the wall. Right, so to make it actually do something, I first need to tag these things as objects that obey the laws of physics. So the first thing I'm going to do here is right click the sphere and go to simulation tags. You can add all sorts of different tags, but for this we're adding a simulation tag, and we're going to rigid body. And for the floor, I want this to be a collider body. In fact, for now, I'm not going to put that on. I'm going to go to cloner, which is the wall. In fact, let me just rename that as wall. And I'm going to right click that, go to simulation tags and go rigid body. Now, if I hit play down here, you'll see that they just fall through the floor, because the floor is not stopping it in any way. And you don't want the floor to fall either. You just want the floor to be a static object that everything is sitting on nicely. So if I right click that and go to simulation tags, as I was going to do earlier, instead of selecting rigid body, you select collider body, because you want this to collide. And now if I hit play, nothing moves, because nothing needs to move, because there's no forces acting upon them. So if I want to give that ball a little nudge, there's many ways that that you could do this, but I'm going to do it a very easy way. What the eye don't see, the animator gets away with. So I'm just going to put in a box there, a cube there, like that, and then I'm going to use the keyframe options. Keyframes basically record the position of something. So if you have it in one position in one frame, and then you move on to another frame and it's in a different position, it will work out the difference. So if I was, for example, to say I want to have that cube there, so I'm going to record the object there, click on that button, and I'm going to go forward a few frames and then move it to there, for example, and then click on keyframe. We'll record active objects to record the keyframes. That will now play a nice smooth movement. But I don't want to do that. That's not what I want to do. So I'm going to undo all of that. So I'm going to record the keyframe position for that. I'm going to move to the next frame and then shift it forward a little bit so it's invading on the ball's space. Maybe a touch more. And then click on record active objects again, and that will now do that very quickly. It will just jump forward in one frame. So if I now right click on that cube, go to simulation tags and say I want that to be a collider body, that will now push the ball. As you can see, now it's not quite working as we want it to yet, but don't worry, we'll get there. So let's have a look a bit further zoomed out at how that works. It kind of works, you know, the ball knocks the wall over, but the wall is kind of acting as a single object. And the reason that is because the simulation tag is over the whole wall, and actually you want it to be on the bricks individually. So if I select that tag and I go to collision and I go to inherit tag and I say I want to apply the tag to children, and I apply it to all the individual elements, then that will start to act like a load of individual bricks. So that's the basics. I can get rid of that cube so we don't actually see it. Up here are two little dots next to each object. So if I click on that one, you can see it disappears from view, but if I render the scene, it's still there. But if I do it on the other one, it also takes it out of the rendered scene. So you wouldn't see the cube actually pushing the box. So to me, apart from the fact that it hasn't got any textures on it and hasn't been lit or anything like that, the bricks are sliding a bit too much. The surface is way too slippery. So we need to go to the floor. I'm also going to go to the sphere and to the wall. I'm going to select all of them by holding down Control and clicking on each of them. And then I'm going to take the bounce down to 5%, and I'm going to up the friction to 80%. Let's see what that does. That looks a bit more realistic. I'm going to see what would happen if I up the friction to say 150% on that. Okay, quite like that. That's all right. If I wanted to make it a bit more dramatic, I'll unhide the cube that's doing the pushing, which I'm going to actually label as pusher. And if I go to the first frame, then go to the second frame and actually move it across a touch more, and then record that position, it will push it a bit faster. And maybe if I make the sphere a bit bigger, so I'm going to make that say 80 centimeters, which means I need to lift it another 30, and maybe start it 30 that way. So here we go. Yeah, I prefer that. I like that. So if I hide the pusher again, and at any point I can render it as it will be once it's outputted. So, next things to do. Let's make it look a bit nicer. So I'm going to put some lights in it. I'm going to start with just one light, which again, holding down Shift, so it drags in increments of 10 centimeters. I'm just going to put a light up there, and I'm going to make it cast shadows, so you can do soft shadows with a density map of 500 by 500. It's just a pretty standard setting for me for any light. And yeah, we've got a bit of shadow now, and then if we play it and we render one of the frames when it's like that, you can see it's got a bit more going on in the scene. It looks a bit more three-dimensional. So the next thing to put on is a bit of texture on the bricks. So I'm going to go down to here to create, and I'm going to say new material. Colour for brick. I sort of want them to be a bit red, I suppose. So I'm going to take out the blue. Yeah, a little bit sort of red, not too orange, sort of reddy brown, something like that. And I'm going to turn off reflectance for now, and I'm just going to put that over the wall. The colour's sort of alright, it's not great, but it's enough for this demo. But it needs a bit of roughness. They look very, very smooth. So the way to do that is I can either double click the material down here, which I'm going to call brick, or double click it up here, and then I get to the menu where you can turn on in basic, where you can turn on all the different ways of manipulating the material, and I'm going to choose bump, go to bump, and there's a texture and want some noise. So if I just put on some random noise, you can see now there's a kind of a texture across the whole thing, which doesn't look that great to me. So I'm going to want to edit this a bit more. I want to say what type of noise it is, so I'm going to go to noise here. There's all different types of noise. So I could go to cranial, I could go to cell noise, blistered turbulence, which might actually work, and I'm going to bring the scale down to about 20%. We'll see. Yeah, that's quite nice. Another one that I quite like So what's the difference between blistered turbulence and turbulence? It's a bit more subtle. I quite like Luca. That to me looks a bit more brick-esque. So at a distance, does that look? It gives it a little bit of texture. It's not amazing, but for the purposes of this demo, it will do. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the wall to make sure that the wall cloner is selected. I'm going to go to MoGraph Effector and go to Random, and this creates some randomness within the cloning. Now, of course, that's way too much. So I only want the positions to... in fact, I don't really want the positions to move at all. I want them to scale down a touch. I'm going to click on Uniform Scale and just make it so some of the bricks can be slightly smaller than some of the others. And see if that just introduces some randomness in the look. Yeah, that looks enough. I mean, you can do it with rotation as well. You could have it so that some of them are rotated, but then you might start to get some overlaps and things can start to be a bit weird. So I'm just going to leave that off for the moment and just do it purely with the scale. Right, the problem with that is that because there's now gaps, because we've messed with the scale, because there's now some gaps, when I hit play, the wall sags slightly. So if I just move forward a few frames, that there could be how I want the wall to start. So now if I click on that there, the simulation tag, and then I go to dynamics and I say set initial state, that can now be how the wall starts. And then I'm going to do another little trick where I'm going to turn off this particular tag so it doesn't actually do anything, as you can see. And I'm only going to activate it when the ball hits the wall. So it's in that frame there. I'm going to turn that on. And then back a frame, it will be off. If you hold down Alt and click on it, that saves the setting or gets rid of it. So now you can see it turns on at that point and it's off on all the previous frames. So now the wall is nice and static until the ball hits it. Let's give the floor a bit of texture. Maybe make it a nice shiny surface or something. I'm going to call this material floor. Over here, over here, I'm going to go for something quite rough. Maybe take the specular down a bit, and I'll give it a bump. Again, I'm just going to go for some noise. Let's pick what type of noise. Let's try displaced turbulence. I mean, it doesn't really matter because we're not... Oh, I haven't actually put the tag on. Hang on 1 second. I'll put the tag on the floor. Yeah, it gives it a tiny bit of roughness. Let me turn the bump up a bit. Yeah, there's a little bit of texture on the floor there. Not completely convinced by the displaced turbulence. Wavy turbulence. Oh, that's interesting. Quite like that. Now I'm going to turn the colour down a bit. So I'm just going to get it a little bit greyer. Maybe a tinge of blue. A touch more blue and a touch more green. Quite like my greeny blues. Yeah, something like that. And then the ball. new material, which I'll put on the sphere, which I'm going to call ball. I'm going to name the material ball as well. For some reason I'm struggling to rename this thing. Ball. And this here, diffuse, don't want it to reflect too much. Not too much specular. And I'm going to make this ball sort of slightly red. Or we could, if I made it black and we changed the reflectance to something like that and gave it a bit of roughness, it could look almost metallic. That looks quite nice. So yeah, that's the basics of how to build a wall, how to knock it down. I mean, you can play about with this in a number of ways. You could duplicate this light. If I just move this down here and make it easy, and I could put in 2 new lights. So you could that's 800 that way, it could be 800 that way. And then you've got sort of multiple shadows being cast, which can look a bit nicer. Probably pull down the oranginess of those bricks. I could go to colour and bring them down a bit. Now they're better lit. I can fiddle about the floor a bit more, but in general, that's kind of what I wanted to show you. So. Hope you got something out of that, and there'll be another video up very soon.